what makes humans so special? What's the secret of our success? We have the most expressive faces in the whole animal kingdom. We have the unique ability to blush. We involuntarily give away our feelings.
So we're evolved to trust each other.
Yeah. And even though we're individually not that special, collectively, we're incredibly, incredibly smart. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we're naturally good, because people can also do horrible things, when they're working together. And there's also a real dark side to our friendliness, our groupishness, tribal behavior.
I will say, if I wanted to get someone to adopt very violent behaviors, I would put them side by side, like make it so that you're like protecting each other. I would put a mask or visor on you, make it so that you actually aren't making like eye contact or can't be seen.
Exactly.
It did make me reflect on what the United States is experiencing right now with very violent behavior on the parts of certain police officers caught on tape in response to the protesters.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so much the opposite of what the police should be.
It is my pleasure to welcome to Yang Speaks the brilliant, the philosophical, and I say that with all honesty because he's literally a philosopher, an intellectual mentor of mine, Rutger Bregman. Rutger, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrew. I was looking forward to this so much. I'm a huge fan.
Huge fan of yours. So Rutger and I first met, though Rutger doesn't remember this very well, but when he gave his TED Talk about poverty and universal basic income in Vancouver, I was in the crowd, watching and thinking like, wow, this guy's amazing. And then I quoted you all the time from then on that poverty is not a lack of character, it's a lack of cash, and referenced that talk, sent it to as many people as I could. And then, of course, your book, Utopia for Realists, also very impactful. Tons of people read it and loved it. And now you have a new book out, Humankind, that I think is just out now. And the subtitle is A Hopeful History. Go ahead and tell us about what led you to write this book.
So the reason I wrote the book is that in the past, say, 15 to 20 years, there's been this silent revolution in science. So many scientists from so many different disciplines, think about sociologists and psychologists and anthropologists and archaeologists, have been moving from a quite cynical view of who we are as a species to a more hopeful view of, what we are and what we can be if we actually believe and if we assume the best in each and every one. So I wanted to connect the dots and show that there was something bigger going on. And on the other hand, there was something else as well. I started to notice actually while promoting my previous book, Utopia for Realists, and as you know, the central idea in that book is universal basic income. I had collected a lot of evidence that this actually works. So many experiments ever since the 1970s in the US, in Canada, and many other places as well, that show that universal basic income is like venture capital for the people, healthcare costs go down, crime goes down, kids do better in school, etc., etc. Like there's so much evidence that it works really well. So I went on a book tour and I talked to, thousands of people about the idea. And again and again and again, after 30 or after 40 minutes, I find myself discussing not just sort of the scientific evidence, but also human nature. Because that is sort of the most common objection people have.
So wait, Rutger. So people would say to you, but people will do terrible things with his money because people are lazy and
selfish,
self-indulgent, and generally immoral beings. Is that a summary?
Yeah, that's what I heard again and again. That people said, oh, this may work on a local scale, or maybe it worked in Canada, or maybe in this place in Europe, but we don't believe it's going to happen on a large scale, and certainly not in the US, because human nature, people are just selfish, people are just, lazy, they're going to waste the money on drugs or alcohol, etc. So then I realized that I actually had to dig a little bit deeper, and I discovered that this view of human nature, this cynical view of human nature, is so deeply embedded in our culture. It goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. and you find it with the Christian church fathers, the notion that we're all sinners. You find it with the Enlightenment philosophers or the founding fathers. John Adams, once wrote an essay with the title, "All Men Would Be Tyrants If They Could." And I think that this idea that people are just selfish has also been at the heart of sort of the capitalist model for decades, that we're just homo economicus, that we're just basically selfish beings. And I think that
we're all rational utility maximizers, right, Rutger? We're all just counting our utiles. trying
that's
to
the
stack
theory.
them as high as we can.
But I mean, it's not a harmless idea, because sort of your theory of human nature tends to produce the kind of people that it presupposes. So there's one economist, Robert Frank, who did these studies with his students, where he actually discovered that if you do a small test where you sort of try to find out how generous people are, and turns out that actually as people progress in their study, as they study economics, they become more selfish. They start, behaving like homo economicus. It's like we teach it to them. So ideas are never merely just ideas.
Well, it's well established, and you reference these studies in the book, that what you expect people to do, you get more of. Like if you have high expectations for a kid and tell them, "Oh, you're great, you're smart, like you'll do well," then their performance actually changes. And obviously the opposite is true too. If you say, "Hey, you're bad at this, you're terrible," then their performance declines. And it sounds like that's true for our decision making too. Like if we're all told, "Hey, you're just going to be out for yourself and maximize your own well-being," then you look around and say, "Okay, I guess that's the way we do things here." But that actually isn't consonant with our nature, really, is what you argue very, very compellingly.
Yeah, exactly. And the same is true for Social Security. If you have a system where you ask people to prove over and over again that they're sick enough, that they're depressed enough, that they're really a hopeless case and they'll never get anything done in their life, and you give them a little bit of support, say food stamps, for example, which is another, again, it's all about distrust. We don't trust you to actually make your own decisions. What are you going to get? Obviously, you're going to make people depressed and dependent. It's a system that produces dependency. And this is why I was so enthusiastic about UBI when I first, read about it in 2013, 2014, because it's all about trusting other people, and this can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you actually trust people to make the right decisions, then you'll discover that the real experts on the poor's lives are the poor themselves, right? They know what they need. But you really got to make this shift in thinking about how you look at human nature.
I want to verify for you two things that you experienced, Rutger. Number one, when I was on the trail arguing for universal basic income, people also objected based upon point of view of human nature as very base, selfish, lazy, and negative. So it wasn't just you. And number two, when I was campaigning around the country, I met so many people who felt diminished by our dehumanizing system of welfare benefits and food stamps. And the worst of them must have been disability, where if you are on disability, you literally have to prove that you're unable to work periodically in order to continue to get benefits. And there was one woman who told me about how she wanted to volunteer in her community, but she was scared to do so because if they saw that she could volunteer, then they might take her disability benefits away. And so there were stories like that over and over again, where our systems end up reinforcing a perception of someone in their own minds also as not being able to do the things they want to do. It's tragic to me. Like and if you present the vast majority of human beings with this viewpoint on themselves, it's like, hey, number one, you're a liar and a cheat. Number two, you actually have like a real problem. Like most people will choose number two. It's like, I actually do have like, this genuine disability, either physical or emotional or mental or whatever it is. Like most people will find themselves in that bucket and not the, I'm actually totally bullshitting and I'm perfectly fine and I just want that set of benefits. Like that's just not the way humans shape their reality.
No. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures. We want to contribute. we want to be someone in society, right? No one or there are very few people who choose to live a life doing nothing, sitting on the couch, watching Netflix all day, because that makes people depressed, right? And obviously we've been very good at sort of keeping people dependent, with these kind of very paternalistic systems of social security. Now, that doesn't mean that we should do away completely with social security, because, poverty is one of the biggest injustices there is in the world. We just should trust people and should build this floor in the whole income distribution. And that is true for the US, and it's also true for Europe, because what you've just been describing, I see this literally the same thing in the Netherlands, where maybe our welfare state is a little bit stronger, right? We have universal healthcare. But then, you have cases where people literally, were fined because they were doing volunteers work while they were on benefits as well, right? Because, oh, no, you can't really do that. It's really this paternalistic system that is all about distrusting other people. And I think we should completely turn that around.
I couldn't agree more. One argument that I hear sometimes here in America is that this model would work in Europe because your societies are more homogeneous, or at least that's the perception. Yeah. And they look at the U.S. and say, there are too many different types of people here, which I sense is generally like they're talking about race, really, when they're talking about this. So this is certainly one thing that has come up. What's your perspective on Europe versus the U.S. in that regard?
I'm really, really skeptical of that argument that UBI is not going to work
obviously.
in the US. Because, to be honest, I think that the US has, it might be the first country that will implement this policy. It seems to me like a very, very American idea. And people forget about this, but it was actually Richard Nixon, at the beginning of the 70s, who almost implemented a modest basic income. It almost happened. And at the end of the 60s, everyone from the left to the right, Republicans, Democrats, they all thought that this was the sensible way forward. The perfect marriage between left-wing and right-wing thinking, right? The left gets the eradication of poverty and a bit of redistribution here to reduce inequality. And the right gets, freedom. Because that's what it's all about. The freedom to make your own choices, right? To have a little bit of your own venture capital so that you can start a new company, move to a different job, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that it's a very, very American idea, or it's a way that America likes to see itself, right?
Rutger, it's one reason why we ended
a problem, right? Europe has, I think, a stronger tradition of paternalism, stronger tradition of social democracy, where often those at the top say, we want to help the poor, but we know what's best for them, right? We're going to help them, right, to make the right decisions. And that's really holding us back.
Well, it's one reason we ended up naming the universal basic income that we fought for the freedom dividend.
Yes.
Where it was very American sounding, and we focus group tested a bunch of different names: universal basic income, social security for all, prosperity dividend, opportunity dividend, freedom dividend. And freedom dividend tested better than anything else that we tried, because
it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I've changed my mind on this. In Utopia for Realists, I still talk about basic income, but dividend is really the right word. Because income assumes that you have to work for it, but it's a dividend because it's a right. Just because you exist, because you're a citizen of your country, because you have a heartbeat, because you have the right passport, that is enough. And why can we afford this? Well, simply because we're already so rich, right? Because our forefathers worked so hard and created all these innovations, all these amazing technologies. We've got all the rent that comes from the land. We've got the rent from, all the buildings that we've built together, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much shared capital, and everyone deserves a share of that. Everyone deserves a dividend from that. So you basically have a platform to stand on. And
I couldn't agree more.
It's a much better concept.
I was telling people this is already your money. And one of the arguments I was making was that your data is getting sold and resold for billions of dollars a year, and you're not seeing a dime of that. You're generating value, and our society now has the wealth to be able to do this. And in the absence of making this kind of move, we're going to wind up in the most extreme winner-take-all economy in the history of the world, which we are already seeing.
Yeah.
In your book, you go through some examples. So I can almost see your wheels turning when you were preparing the book, because you were trying to figure out, okay, why is it that we all think that we're terrible? like what are like the great pillars of Western thought or experiments that have established for us all that if you leave a bunch of people alone, we're going to turn on each other, Lord of the Flies style. And you obviously use Lord of the Flies as one example.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating for you to try and go through and inspect and re-examine each of the major reasons why we've all taken for granted that human beings are shitty, terrible creatures if you leave us alone.
Yeah. Well, if you write a book like this, you know that you're going to get the response, but what about this? What about that? What about, right? That's the response you get all the time. So I knew that it had to be a fairly big book. And indeed, I decided to start with Lord of the Flies, one of the most famous novels of the 20th century. It's about a group of kids that end up on an island, an uninhabited island, after an airplane crash. And they have to, set up some kind of society to survive. And it doesn't really work. Turns out that civilization is only a very thin veneer. And if you leave these kids alone, even though they went to a really good British boarding school, they were very well behaved, but, they turn into savages. At least that's what happens in the novel written by William Golding. It was published in the 50s and it became, a huge bestseller. Millions and millions of kids had to read it in school.
We all used Lord of the Flies as a thing. It's like, oh, he's going to go Lord of the Flies. Like it's like a shorthand.
Yeah. Did you have to read it in school or not?
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
I did.
Well, I read it when I was 16 or 17 or something like that. And I still remember, the effect it had on me. I felt like, oh, well, that's depressing, but maybe this is more realistic as well. No more Harry Potter for me. But then for this book, I decided to see and find out whether there's ever been a real life Lord of the Flies case, right? Has it ever happened in all of world history that real kids shipwrecked on a real island? And what would have happened? So after a couple of months of research, I did find a case, actually in 1965, in Tonga, which is an island group in the Pacific Ocean. There were 6 kids who were bored of their boring school and they hated the school meals. So what they decided to do is to steal a boat and get away. Now, in the first night, they ended up in a storm. They drifted for 8 days, ended up on this uninhabited island, and survived for 15 months. And
how long?
15 months. Yeah, 15 months. So the crazy thing is that if you look at the real Lord of the Flies, like this real story, in almost every single way, it's the opposite of the fictional Lord of the Flies. It's a story of friendship, of hope, and of resilience. And actually, these guys are still friends today. And I managed to talk to them.
I mean, you have hopefully you're bonded for life by the fact that you got shipwrecked together, and you didn't eat each other. So now you're each other's like. Christmas list.
Exactly.
Like, remember that time when we built like the lean-to together?
Exactly. Now, I mean, obviously, this is not a scientific experiment, right? I know that. It's just one story. But I think that if millions of kids have to read about the fictional Lord of the Flies, then they deserve to know about this story as well. And I think it's also important because maybe you experienced this as well while you were touring, is that people are just more moved by stories than by scientific data, etc. I mean, data helps. I love math. But in the end, we human beings, we are the stories that we tell ourselves, right? And for centuries, we've been telling ourselves quite cynical stories. I concluded the same thing
after months on the campaign trail, Rutger, is that I led off talking about data, and I was like, and it's pretty self-explanatory, and that you needed to shift towards stories and people and emotional appeals and different modes of communication as quickly as possible. I figured it out. It took me months, but you're right. Just agree with you.
But probably you need both, right? I think what I try to do in this book is to have powerful stories, but then also, the research where I try to zoom out, right? I try to rely as much as possible on meta-analyses, where researchers take a whole bunch of studies, put them together, and to see what the bigger picture is. Because, in science so often the problem is obviously that, especially in psychology, so much research doesn't replicate. They have one exciting study and it, gets to the front page of Nature or of Science, one of the big journals. But then 2 years later, you hear, well, it didn't really replicate. So I wanted to write a book that people could still read 10 years from now. And then you have to take a very different approach.
Also, the real life Lord of the Flies was fascinating. One other story I found fascinating, or this phenomenon, was that when you looked closely at soldiers in different military conflicts when they were using muskets, a majority of them apparently did not fire at the enemy. They fired above them. They pretended to reload over and over again. They essentially tried to do anything they could to look okay without firing on each other. And I found that to be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, me too. It was a big surprise for me. I didn't know that before, but it turns out that actually we've been brainwashed a little bit by Hollywood and Netflix, and we've been watching too many series like Game of Thrones, which give us the impression that violence is very difficult. Now, obviously, we human beings, we can be really nasty, right? On the one hand, I think we've evolved to be friendly, and there's a lot of evidence for that actually for millennia was the friendliest among us, who had the most kids, and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. But we're also clearly capable of, a lot of nasty things and cruel things. You could even argue that we're the cruelest species in the animal kingdom, right? We engage in wars and ethnic cleansing and genocide. But then we do not find that easy. So indeed, if you look at the history of warfare, what you find is there are a lot of examples of soldiers, just average soldiers who have been drafted and who can't really fire their guns. There's one very famous study done by an American historian that's also a bit controversial. So let me tell a bit more about that. His name is S.L.A. Marshall, and he found out, or at least he estimated, that only around 15 to 25% of soldiers, American soldiers during the Second World War, actually fired their guns, right? And since then, there's been a lot of follow-up research that indeed confirmed this, that it's just difficult. You have to be conditioned first and brainwashed a little bit first before you actually manage to pull the trigger. We're not born to kill. We're really not. And actually, if soldiers do manage to kill in wars, we saw this a lot after the war in Vietnam, they come back and they're traumatized, right? They have PTSD, which suggests to me that maybe, we're not born to do this. We're obviously capable of it. But, we don't get a great psychological reward most of the time. Actually, most of the time, we actually damage something or kill something in ourselves when we kill someone else.
One thing that seems to be universally true is that when soldiers did take certain actions, shooting, killing others, taking on dangers to themselves, it often was because of a degree of camaraderie or comradeship, and they wanted to protect the people around them. They didn't want to let someone else down. It did make me reflect on what the United States is experiencing right now with the George Floyd killing and then the protests afterwards. And you are seeing very violent behavior on the parts of certain police officers caught on tape in response to the protesters, where there was the 75-year-old man in Buffalo who got shoved down and cracked his skull, and I believe he's still hospitalized. There are other shots of police officers just like batoning students or shooting students with rubber bullets. And one of the things that, because I was reading Humankind, and then looking around at what's going on around the world, you look around and say, okay, if we're basically good and not really wired to naturally turn on each other in these ways, yet we're seeing some examples that very much reflect the opposite. And I will say, if I wanted to get someone to adopt very violent behaviors, a few things I would do is I would train them And like, you talk about trying to brainwash soldiers in various ways. I would put them side by side, like make it so that you're like protecting each other. I would put a mask or visor on you, make it so that you actually like aren't making like eye contact or can't be seen by the people that you're inflicting violence on. I'd have like a culture around that, like where you do get a sense that some of these some of these police departments have a very, very strong culture that reflects almost like a military unit.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so much the opposite of what the police should be. I think a real police officer should be a kind of social worker, right? It's really important that you know everyone in your neighborhood. That you know the grandmothers and the grandfathers and the aunts and the uncles, that people just basically trust you, so they can be your ally in fighting crime, right? And actually solving real serious crime. This is what we call community policing. And I think that here, actually, the US has to learn something from a couple of European countries. In London, for example, like 90% of police officers don't wear guns, because the philosophy is that if you show up with guns and with riot gear, what kind of message is that you're sending? If you show up at a peaceful protest, in riot gear, what do you want? Now, if you then look at Norway, Norway is really the gold standard here. If you look at the whole criminal justice system. Also, if you look at the prisons, actually, which are the complete opposite of how they've organized everything in the US. So in the US, you have these systems where, the taxpayer is basically paying for institutions where people come in as citizens and they come out as criminals, right? It's like universities for crime. That's what prisons often are. In Norway, they've got the complete
It's
opposite.
even worse, Rutger, and we need to get rid of this in the U.S., but it's even worse if you have for-profit prisons, because they literally have a financial incentive around recidivism and lower incentives to try and rehabilitate
it's bizarre,
people properly.
Isn't it? It's so sinister. Anyway, what they have in Norway is the opposite. And it's very strange, actually, if you look at it, because it goes completely in the other direction. Here you have these places where the inmates have the freedom to socialize with the guards. They can make music, they even have their own music studio and their own music label, which is called Criminal Records. I thought that was particularly hilarious. But then you look at the results, and indeed, Norway has the lowest recidivism rate in the whole world. The lowest chance that someone will commit another crime once he or she gets out of prison. And then you look at the financial side of the whole thing, and it turns out, just like with UBI, it actually saves money because you spend less on healthcare and you create these law-abiding, tax-paying citizens. The chance that someone will find a job in Norway after he or she has gone to prison goes up with 40%. 40%. In the US, it goes down by I don't know how much. So in the US, you have these really expensive institutions that cost money. In Norway, you have these institutions that, also cost quite a bit of money, but actually get you a return on investment, that is twice as large as the initial investment. And I think that's exactly the same thing with UBI. UBI is also all about investing in people so that they'll actually become creative and they'll start a company and, find a job and they, start paying taxes, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about getting a return on your investment. So I think there, in the whole sort of defund the police debate, I think that we can learn something from these Scandinavian countries.
There's a lot to learn, and one of the quotes I repeated on the trail was from a corrections officer in New Hampshire, and he said to me, "We should pay people to stay out of jail because we spend so much when they're in jail." Like he saw all of the waste and expense that went into our Department of Corrections, and it was not rehabilitating people, and in the States, if you come out of jail, it's very hard to find a job on multiple levels. But one reason is that employers will not hire you. There are laws around your disclosing prior convictions and criminal record, and an employer would just rather not take a chance.
Yeah. And then just think about the huge waste of talent here. Just to think about how many Einsteins we lost to mass incarceration. Just think about how many Einsteins we lost to poverty. It's just, Yeah, it's
You,
very
you know what?
depressing.
I mean, I agree with you, Rutger, but one of the things I always try and argue too is like, we don't need them to be Einsteins. You know
No,
what I mean?
I agree. Yeah. No, garbage collector is pretty fantastic as well. Actually, this is one of the points that I tried to make in my previous book, Utopia for Realists, and in this book as well, is that we need to revalue or rethink what the really important work is, right? We very often focus on the innovators, on the people who make something new, but the maintainers are also very important, or maybe even more important. There's this example that the anthropologist David Graeber always gives. If you have like a cup, you produce it once, a cup, but you wash it 1,000 times, right? So what's more important, the maintenance or the production?
Well, certainly during this pandemic, we've seen just how vital essential workers are, much more important than what people think of as like, the high order intellectual work. I mean, like, no one gives a shit about, about my thoughts and feelings if you can't get food, if you can't get shelter, if you don't have someone picking up the garbage, it's like piling up, and everything else.
Yes.
So I agree with you that hopefully we can rebalance that sense of what work is valuable. But
this is, Andrew, this is, I think, the most important aspect actually of UBI, is that you'll give a huge amount of additional bargaining power to the people who actually do the essential work, because they can always fall back on their basic income. I get this question a lot, is that people say, Rutger, but who's gonna clean my house if people have a basic income? They won't want to do that anymore. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly the point. You got to pay a proper salary for people who do really important work, right? They'll get more bargaining power, so their wages will have to go up. And that's exactly, that's the point. And if you can't afford that, well, then maybe clean your house yourself, right? So that you'll learn, what's so important to you. It's such a redistribution, not only of income, but also of respect, that we actually understand what's so important.
It values people intrinsically. And one of the arguments I make is like, look, we have to be able to say to our kids, your country loves you, your country values you, and your country will invest in you. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't agree with you more that even with this floor, people would be out there working as hard as ever on all sorts of things, better things. Mm-hmm. We'd recognize the kind of work that people are actually doing, that they want to do. And it would make it impossible or much, much harder to exploit people the way that people are being exploited right now. Yeah. Where you have people who are getting paid subsistence wages or less in the United States. And so if you look at some of these jobs, we'd probably be investing in automating many of them if they're just so punishing or unpleasant that people don't want to do them. And that is better. Like, that's an upgrade. It's like when people look at, and this is not like, I worked at a fast food diner myself, so it's good work. But if people are like, oh, look at these fast food jobs, it's like, oh, we should try and like preserve these jobs, and it's like, really, like what is like the purpose of a job here? It's like if we could make that McDonald's function with fewer people, maybe that's a positive thing. Like, we don't necessarily need to be trying to safeguard these opportunities if they're opportunities that people genuinely would not want to do if they felt like they had some meaningful choice.
Yes, I agree. And this is what I learned from traveling around a little bit, is that on the one hand, I agree with you that, automation is something very worrying, and we should be talking about it way more. But then on the other hand, we also should not underestimate our culture's extraordinary ability to come up with new jobs that don't really need to exist, right? Or what some people call bullshit jobs or socially meaningless jobs. And so I made a trip to Japan.
Rutger Bregman, pro bullshit jobs.
No, I'm against bullshit jobs. No, but I mean, 2 years ago, I visited Japan, and what's one of the striking things you see if you just walk around in a city like Tokyo, you see so many jobs that don't need to exist. Way more even than in the US, and especially more than in Europe. There's roadworks going on, for example, and there are like 7-8 people standing next to it, all pointing you the way where you have to pass, like go to the left, to the right, where it's already perfectly clear, in which direction you have to go, but still they invent these jobs. And then I realized that if you have a society where we say to people, your whole dignity and, the way we're going to value you as a person, it's totally dependent on your job, and you really need a job. Otherwise, we're going to think you're we're not going to value you. Yeah, then obviously the system is going to create a huge amount of jobs that don't really need to exist, that robots could do, because that's just sort of the cultural effect of it. So that's why I started to believe that we need to take a step further and actually have this deeper debate about what role work actually plays in our society, right? And what is real work?
Yeah, no, and I all the time talk about my wife Evelyn and how she's at home with our two boys, one of whom is autistic, and what does the market value her work at?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Does it even consider it work or a job?
Yeah.
What about the millions of stay-at-home parents and single moms around the United States? Do you have a family yourself, Rutger? I actually don't know this about you.
Well, I'm married, but I don't have kids. I'm a young man.
Are you a newlywed? Is that recent? Or congratulations in order?
No, that's 4 years ago. We've been together for 10 years. So, yeah.
Oh, well, congrats. But yeah, like there are different forms of work that right now we don't recognize as a quote unquote job, that to me really are some of the most important things that we do. You know, like if you're taking care of your ailing relative, that's exhausting and vital, and the sort of thing that people struggle with, even if they don't have other obligations at that time. And so, you know, like trying to respect what makes us human beings, to me, is one of the most important facets of universal basic income.
Yeah, I agree. So look, I have a question for you, Andrew. What I've been thinking about quite a lot is how long is this shift going to take, right? How long is it going to take to really push these new ideas forward? If we zoom out a little bit, then you actually see that in the 60s, you know, in America, people were talking about UBI, guaranteed basic income, and it was almost implemented. What was a huge surprise for me is that actually the US was the first country to experiment with these kind of radical prisons that they now have in Norway, right? Originally, it's not a Norwegian idea. It's actually originally an American idea. And
the government of the United States of America sent out just money to thousands of Americans around the country just to see what would happen. I mean, today it would seem unfathomable that the U.S. government would do that, but we did it. Yeah.
And so I am hopeful about sort of the shift we've seen, I think, in the past 5-6 years, whether you think about, you know, climate change. I think people take that much more seriously. Think about inequality. There's a lot more attention for that right now. And it's also actually striking if you look at, you know, the support for these kind of ideas. The vast majority of Americans support higher taxes on the rich, a Green New Deal.
As an observer, Rutger, what do you think happened in the United States of America that we came this close to having a basic income in the 60s, and then it just left the radar entirely? Maybe until recently, maybe like I helped drag it back into the light, but what the heck happened over those intervening 50 years that was this close to passage and was front and center, became so obscured and ignored?
So there are a couple of like really crazy coincidences here. Is that, for example, the Republicans became convinced that basic income is a terrible thing for marriage, right? Because they saw this spike in divorce rates in one of the experiments, in an experiment in Seattle. Turns out that later that it was actually a statistical mistake that had been made. So there was no rise in divorce rates at all. Some of these crazy coincidences matter, but it's also sort of...
We should actually stop there for a second, Rutger, because this seems like a very proto or a pro-feminist tack, which is, hey, if people all have enough money, then maybe people won't stay in marriages that they're not excited about.
Now we would say that's actually a great idea, you know? Yes, we want a higher divorce rate when people get a basic income, because that's probably a sign that people were stuck in terrible marriages. But, you know, it probably was not the case in this Seattle experiment. I know that there's been a basic income experiment in India where they did see a rise in divorce rates. But there's also obviously been this huge ideological shift since the 60s and the 70s. And yeah, there were really these guys. I've got one chapter in my previous book about that. Think about the economist Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, who in the 50s were really in the minority. They were sort of the capitalist resistant fighters, and they really believed in basically privatizing everything. But then they started developing their ideas and their institutions, and they took over, I think, in the 70s and the 80s. They used the crisis, and then Reagan and Thatcher, used their ideas, and they changed the world. So I think, as a historian, I think that real change takes like a generation or something like that. And everything depends, as Milton Friedman himself said, on the ideas that are lying around at a moment of crisis. So that's, I think, why it was so important, that people like you already started, years ago with building this movement for UBI, because it just takes time, it just takes time. And there will be a moment when suddenly ideas that used to be dismissed as unrealistic and unreasonable and crazy can suddenly move into the mainstream and make the march through the institutions, right? But they have to be on the agenda first. And that takes a lot of hard work and patience. But yeah, that's what you see if you zoom out.
You've had a hand in history, Rutger. I guarantee you.
I don't know about that.
No, you 100% have, because even your TED Talk ended up impacting many people that I ran across, and me, obviously. And then I championed this, and you're seeing now millions of Americans come our way, where now the vast majority of Americans support emergency cash relief to help address this pandemic. And one of the arguments I've made, because I completely agree with you that Milton Friedman and the cult of shareholder value and all that stuff really overtook a lot of American thought, is that somehow we have been brainwashed over the last 50 years to think that somehow we exist to serve the economy, and that we're all like inputs into this machine. And if you look at someone like Martin Luther King, he supported basic income and was fighting for it when he was killed. And we now have a national holiday around his birthday, which I don't know if you've spent enough time in the States to know this is how it goes, but like every year his birthday comes and it's a holiday and all the kids get school off. And then there are these snippets of him speaking, generally the I have a dream speech, or that there'll be just this this set of messages around racial equality. And I've been arguing, it's like, why don't they play his everyone should get a guaranteed income speach? Like play that speech.
They don't want you to hear that.
No, they don't. And the last 50 years have really been a complete victory for this market-based thinking. And the question is, how does the pendulum swing the other direction? I'm very optimistic that the pendulum is swinging the other direction very quickly because of the realities that we're faced with, particularly in the U.S. now. I don't know how the situation is in the Netherlands, but we're facing Depression-era levels of unemployment.
Well, it seems to me that in the U.S. there's often this, what I think is a very stupid debate about capitalism versus socialism, or the market versus the government, as if that is sort of the opposition. You have this whole generation of thinkers, intellectuals, and politicians that grew up during the Cold War, and this is sort of the black and white view they have when they think about the economy and politics. And I think that's nonsense, and that's also why I like your approach of sort of humanity first and human-centered capitalism, right? If you look at the model that we have in other countries, or in the US and the UK in the 60s, you had much higher taxes on the rich, and you had stronger economic growth and stronger innovation as well. So maybe these things can be true at the same time. If you have something like Medicare for all, universal healthcare, that's actually more efficient. It helps to make capitalism work better. It's cheaper, and it delivers better results. And you have it in pretty much every developed country except the US. And even conservatives in Canada and the UK, they love it. They absolutely love it, right? Conservatives would never dream of, going against the NHS in the UK. Actually, they use the NHS to sort of bash the European Union and say, okay, we're going to get out of the EU and then give more money to the NHS, right? That's what the populists did in the UK. So I never like this discussion that you so often have about capitalism versus socialism in the US. I think it's totally stupid.
it is so dumb and destructive because you wind up in this ridiculous, incoherent conversation. I tried to express this point of view during one of the debates, and universal healthcare is so good for the economy on so many levels, not just because you'd end up rationalizing the costs, but how many people in the United States, you don't know this, but I do, how many people in the United States have thought about starting a business or doing something independent and then froze in their tracks because they didn't know what they were going to do about their healthcare?
Well,
I guarantee you millions, because in America, like, your healthcare coverage is tied to your job. And so you're like, well, can't do anything to jeopardize that.
Yeah.
And they even have a term for it. It's called job lock. So there's a ton of job lock in the United States. It's stifling entrepreneurship and risk taking and job switching. Like, if you were to get healthcare off of this employment basis, it would be this enormous economic catalyst in the US. It's just good for business and creativity and entrepreneurship and humanity.
Yeah.
And it's the right thing to do. And our system is a complete mess on multiple levels. So one of the big questions is how the US is going to end up making that transition. The US has a lot of legacy structures that are going to be very difficult to reform.
Yeah. There's one thing actually where the US has been pretty great in terms of having an ambitious and robust state, which is when we talk about innovation. Now, the reason that the US has invested a lot in sort of radical and fundamental innovation, actually more than European countries, is because they also always call it defense or the military, right? So many of the fundamental innovations in the past couple of decades have come out of military research. There's this wonderful economist, I think she's one of the great thinkers of our time right now, Mariana Mazzucato, Italian economist, who's pointed out that, you know, every sliver of fundamental innovation in the iPhone, you know, everything that makes it a smartphone instead of a stupid phone, has come out of research, you know, done by researchers that were on the government payroll. You know, either, you know, funded by big European grants or mostly by the US military. So touchscreen, you know, voice recognition system, battery, internet, mobile technology, you name it. Everything that makes it a smartphone. Now, does that mean that we don't need Apple or other companies like that? Obviously, we need them, right? It's great if they use these innovations and make a great product out of that. But then let's at least let them pay taxes, right? So that we can fund the new round of innovation. In green technology, for example. So I think this is sort of an example where it's become so perfectly clear that it's stupid to think in this opposition between the market and the state, right? They actually need each other. You know, the market needs sort of the bold venture capitalists that really can use a huge amount of money, you know, to put in fundamental research. And obviously there's going to be a lot of failures there as well, right? Just the same. I mean, you're an entrepreneur, you know that. Solyndra or something like that. Yeah, I mean, there are casualties. That happens. But people forget this, you know. Elon Musk, he received like $5 billion in US government funding. And we see him as the model of private entrepreneurship.
He's like the real life Tony Stark, but he's very open about the fact. It's like, look, Tesla,
and it's great. It's great.
SpaceX.
I mean, it's not. I'm saying that. Oh, Elon Musk is. It's not something we should blame him. We should applaud him for this, right? Is that he had this idea?
Agreed, because he's trying to solve the biggest problems, and if you're going to solve the biggest problems, the fact that the government supported you is fantastic. It means something actually worked.
Yeah, exactly. But then the problem with this is that we remember Solyndra, right, when a government investment goes wrong, but we forget about, you know, the fact that actually the US government invested a huge amount of money in Elon Musk, right, and in SpaceX and in Tesla and you name it.
And the program that Solyndra's associated with, I believe, got paid back fully anyway. Like it wasn't even a net loser. But that just speaks to the nature of our politics in the U.S., where it's become much more about scoring points and less about effective policy. You know, the concern that we have here in the States is that DC is so far behind the curve and unable to refresh itself or update itself, and that our competitiveness is happening in spite of our government rather than being led by it in many regards. You know, I mean, that's one reason I ran for president, is the modernization of how we do things in the U.S., including basic income, which strikes me as like the next step of the way we get resources into people's hands. I want to return to the book, and for those of you watching the video, it's like this is what it looks like. This is just proof of Humankind, a hopeful history. So when you were doing this research, like it is very interesting to me about how you almost had to like combat your own training, where like we've all been trained so thoroughly that people stink, and and that if you put us in circumstances that are uncontrolled, then like bad things will happen. And then you were digging in, trying to figure out, it's like, wait, why do we think that? Like, what are like the major touch points? You debunked some of them, you contextualized others, you introduced new stories. And one of the things that you took from it, which I thought was really interesting, was that there is like a very, very small subset of people for whom violence and bad behavior is not wholly unnatural. And unfortunately, a lot of those people wind up finding themselves in positions of authority in our modern life. And this was one explanation on offer as to why certain atrocities have occurred, or certain like just like examples obviously of cruelty and inhumanity, if you put it that way. So where are you now, Rutger? Like, have you convinced yourself about the essential goodness of humanity? And I agree with you on so many levels. Just about everything you write and argue, I agree with. So some of the things that I think most everyone can agree on, it's like, look, expectations actually influence behavior. And if you go around telling people they're terrible, then and utility maximizers, and they might actually act like that. But if you tell them they're actually good people and care about their family members and neighbors and will do the right thing in most contexts, even if they don't have like a person behind them with a stick, like ready to punish them if they don't do the right thing, you'll do the right thing most of the time. Like, I think that actually ends up improving behavior for the vast majority of humans. I think that having structures in place that imbue us with the sense of confidence that people believe in us and are investing in us and trust us to make our own decisions is fundamentally empowering in the right way to go, and will end up producing the next level of human progress and advancement. Now, I do think that they're like, people listening to this or watching this are asking this very same question that I asked myself, and I'm asking you now, is like, do I really believe that people are good innately, and that some of the evils I see in the world are a result of like a handful of bad actors gaining control, and these cultures of like reinforcement that enable people to do terrible things?
Well, I wouldn't say that people are naturally good. We're not angels. We're clearly capable of a lot of nasty stuff, jealousy, aggression, you name it. But we have evolved to work together and to connect with each other. You can ask the question, what makes humans being so special? What's the secret of our success? Why do we build pyramids and spaceships, and why have we conquered the globe, and why not the bonobos or the gorillas or the Neanderthals? And what biologists now think is that it's actually our capacity of friendliness that's really our true superpower. Because individually we're not that smart, we're not that special. If you do an intelligence test and you let a human toddler of around 2 years old compete with a pig, then often the pig wins. So don't eat bacon because pigs are smart, right? But that's another book. If you do like a boxing match with a chimpanzee, you're not going to have a nice experience. You're going to be smashed, basically. So we're not very strong. We're not that smart compared to other species, but we can just collaborate and work together on a scale that other animals just can't. There's this saying from Isaac Newton, the great physicist, who once said that if he had seen further than others, it was by standing on the shoulders of giants. And I think that's wrong, actually. I think that if human beings have seen further than others, it's because they're standing on the shoulders of dwarfs. We're just a lot of dwarfs standing on top of each other, and that makes us so smart, right? There's one really wonderful example from the anthropologist Joseph Henrich that I use in the book as well, where he says, well, imagine a planet where there are two sort of tribes. The one tribe is called the copycats, and the other tribe is called the geniuses. Now, the geniuses are really smart. You know, they're Einsteins. They come up with brilliant inventions on their own. But the problem is that they're not very social. They're not very friendly. So if they invent something, they don't share it with their friends. Now,
this sounds like me as a kid.
But then the copycats, they're not that smart. They're a little bit more like me. But they do like to share, you know, what they read, what they know, what they find out, what they discover. So when a copycat, you know, when there's this exceptional event that a copycat comes up with something new, then quickly everyone knows about it. Now, if you let these two tribes sort of compete in history, what you'll actually discover is that the copycats end up with way more innovations than the geniuses. Because geniuses, well, they invent a lot, but they just don't remember it. While what we have is cumulative culture. You know, we built languages, we built all the kinds of innovations, etc. And even though we're individually not that special, collectively we're incredibly, incredibly smart. And again, by the way, this is a philosophical argument for UBI, yeah? for a freedom dividend, because it basically says, look, our prosperity comes from the collective, right? It's because we're just so good at working together. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we're naturally good, because people can also do horrible things, you know, when they're working together. And there's also a real dark side to our friendliness, you know, our groupishness, our tribal behavior.
Tribalism.
Yeah, exactly. We do a lot of the most nasty things in the name of friendship and in the name of loyalty and in the name of comradeship. This is exactly what, the dark dynamic that you see in history, and maybe now also in the US, you know, this extraordinary, this in-group, out-group behavior that, you know, just grows and grows and grows. And what you need then is actually to try and ignore your intuition and maybe zoom out a little bit, use your rationality and think, hey, wait a minute, those other people in those other group, they're quite similar to me. You know, they're also just human beings with the same, you know, intuitions and desires, etc.
So you wouldn't call us necessarily like the good humans, but you would call us the collaborative, the sharing, the groupish humans.
Yes. And here it's also interesting that sometimes if you want to do the right thing, the good thing, you actually have to go against your own friendliness, right? If you look at, you know, the heroes in our history, the people who really went against the status quo, they were not that friendly. They were often described as nasty and as difficult. I mean, we were talking about Martin Luther King. Nowadays, he's like this hero. He's like this saint, and you know, you get a free day in the US. Oh, we all love Martin Luther King. Actually, back then, he was very, very controversial. You know, a lot of white people hated him. He was a radical. Yeah, people hated him. But that's what we forget, right? People have a bad memory when it comes to these kind of things. So often, progress doesn't come from friendly people. You know, it often comes from unfriendly people who are willing to go against the status quo. Now, that doesn't mean everyone should be unfriendly, right? I think that in any movement, there are different roles to play. The two people I thought of
when you raised that, in addition to Martin Luther King, were Steve Jobs and Bernie Sanders. No offense, Bernie. Bernie's a great guy. but those were just two people that just popped into my mind as like folks that you don't think of as warm and cuddly, but they moved us forward.
Yeah. And then, I mean, you need other people as well, right? Any movement has a whole variety of roles. You need people who are willing to be dragged away by the riot police, but then you also need people who are, you know, really good networkers and are able to build coalitions and actually bring people together again, right? And who are willing to make uncomfortable compromises to at least get something done. So often we have this preference for a particular kind of activism. We're like, oh, I love Andrew Yang, but I don't like Bernie Sanders. Or I love Greta Thunberg, but I hate Extinction Rebellion. But what if all of us actually have a role to play, right? What if we
all have a role to play?
Yeah.
It's kind of wonderful and magical, Rutger, but you know, on this journey, Like I meet folks who are all just playing this very distinct, remarkable role, and we're all different from each other, but we're all pushing in the same general direction. I certainly feel that way about universal basic income. And I want to support your depiction of humanity from all my time on the trail. The vast majority of the people I met, and these were people, all walks of life, all over the country, very, very rural communities of, like no traffic light, and all the way up, to the big cities. The vast majority of the people I met were good, open-minded, cooperative, friendly for sure. Like I show up in so many towns that, just me and my team in the rental car and just like pop out and speak at the cafe or the home or the union hall. And it was great. Like there were so many wonderful people, and even people that maybe disagreed with me were very happy to hear me out and would say like, thank you for being here. Like, that sense that human beings are generally open and caring and communal was borne out by my time on the trail.
Yeah.
Like that's one of the major feelings I've had over the last number of months and years. You probably had the same set of experiences because you've traveled the world, whereas I've been all over the United States, but I have to say I have not left the country in quite some time because I've been campaigning here.
Yeah. Well, if you want to lose your prejudices, travel is a great medicine. It's relatively easy to hate or dislike people who are far away, that you just see their Twitter profile and then they're like these abstract people, the immigrant far away or the Democrat or the Republican, blah, blah, blah. It's really difficult to actually hate someone who's standing in front of you because human beings have evolved for face-to-face contact, right? We have the most expressive faces in the whole animal kingdom. We have the unique ability to blush. No other primate does that. We do it. We involuntarily give away our feelings, which is, I think that's fascinating that has been an evolutionary advantage for us. I think the reason is that it helps to establish trust. And we also have very unique eyes, right? If you compare our eyes with like all the other primate species, and there are like 200 primate species in total, we are the only ones that have white around our eyes. So I can see you looking at me right now. And it's just easier to follow our gazes, while with chimpanzees or bonobos, that's much, much harder to see what they're actually looking at.
I never did trust those bonobos.
Well, actually, bonobos are relatively friendly. Did you know that? Bonobos are like these, they're sort of like, they're not xenophobic, but they're how do you say that? Philia is they just love strangers. What often happens if you have like two groups of bonobos and they meet each other for the first time is that they have an orgy. They have this that's sort of their way of bonobos. Saying hi. Now, I'm not saying we have to do that, but there's actually quite a lot of things we can learn from the bonobos.
So we're evolved to trust each other, so that we can see where we're looking, we can see how our faces express emotion.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to be on the trail, right? To actually go out and meet other people, just to remember that, what we see of each other on Twitter and Facebook or on the news, that's not reality. And, this is the problem. I think that those at the top, the cynical rulers in power, right, who want to keep the way keep things the way they are right now. They want you to watch as much CNN as possible. They want you to watch as much Fox News as possible because they know that, if you follow a lot of the news, then you are going to be more cynical and more scared. And it's simply easier to rule people who are scared. And it's more difficult to rule people who have a more trusting attitude to life because they're like, well, maybe we can just do things on our own, right? Maybe we can live in a genuine democracy where, average citizens just get to have a say as well. So
maybe
throughout
we
history,
can give everyone $2,000 a month and that would be A-okay.
Yeah. No, it's a dangerous idea. I think that those at the top have often been afraid of the idea of freedom for everyone. because they're worried that they won't be necessary anymore.
I agree with you. I think that we do have a set of institutions in place that don't trust people, and that's fed into our leaders and our media, our policy. To me, running on universal basic income, it strikes me as so obvious. I was like, we should totally do this. By the way, if we don't do this, we're fucked. But we should totally do this for like a multitude of very beautiful human reasons. And the fact that so many folks who are in positions of power just resisted it so mightily for a variety of reasons. It was like, why are you resisting this? Like, what's wrong with giving everyone money? We should have done this decades ago. So I couldn't agree with you more that there's like that there's a strange tension or disconnect between trusting people and how we're organizing our society right now. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens. If you are like me, you eat food every day, but then you notice that you're not getting a whole lot in the way of greens and vegetables, and you think, like, man, maybe I'm missing something. And enter Athletic Greens. They sent me their package. It was delightful. You know, like there's a sense of accomplishment every time you drink it because you're like, ooh, I can sense my body's getting something that it has needed and wanted that I have been too lazy to actually get for it. Because I have a feeling most people are like me, where it's like, you'll eat vegetables if they're in front of you, but like, are you really going to seek them out? Like, are you really just going to go to the freaking vegetable aisle in the grocery store and be like, oh yeah, sign me up for these? Like that's not really the move, you know? So if you are like me and you want to experience the nutritional benefits of vegetables in a convenient way, get Athletic Greens. It's pretty much exactly like what it just sounds like. It's like a shake drink made of greens. And if you go to athleticgreens.com/yang to claim our special offer of 20 free daily travel packs with your first purchase, that's a $79 added value of Athletic Green goodness. So that's athleticgreens.com/yang.
I'll add that these actually taste pretty good too, having tried them. It's like you empty the packet, pour it in some water, shake it up, and it tastes great. So athleticgreens.com/yang.
What do you think about the danger of the corruption of power? You know, because this is one of the findings that I came back to again and again during my research, is that power is like this drug where, you know, you put people who are powerful in a brain scanner, and they're the regions that are involved with empathy, they don't really work that well anymore.
They've got brain damage.
People don't blush anymore. I mean, I think the idea of like Boris Johnson or Bolsonaro or Trump blushing, I mean, I think we find that hard to imagine. So power is this very dangerous thing, and nomadic hunter-gatherers already knew this. So they had this strong culture where humbleness was really important, right? Where you sort of, made jokes about yourself, and you were not sort of allowed by the group to boast and say, oh, I'm so great and blah, 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 because they knew that power was a dangerous thing. But now we've ended up in this society where it's not survival of the friendliest anymore, but it often seems to be survival of the shameless. And I guess this is the problem that we run into again and again as a society, is that we just find it hard to control those in power and to make sure that they stay humble.
It's a real problem. I saw your research into how power reduces empathy and changes the way your brain is wired. And it's consistent with my experiences, frankly, interacting with tons of very, very powerful people. Like the best of the powerful people still have a degree of humanity. I do think that there's some overlap with being a woman or with being a part of a group that, frankly, doesn't see itself as powerful, with every type of interaction, where they get reminded of what it's like to be on the other side. more often than if you were like a powerful man or a powerful white man, depending upon the context. But I think that the brain damage is real, and I've been trying to figure out how to combat it. One thing I'm for is term limits, because I think, well, if you're going to get brain damaged by power, let's just have you in there. You can do a few things, and then we get you out. And then we'll put someone else in who hasn't really been that screwed up yet. Or maybe there are some kind of exercises that we have our leaders do that try to keep them human. But I've experienced a very watered down version of this record, because I'm obviously it's like I'm in my home just like many other people. But even for me, I saw my my attitudes and behavior getting pushed in a particular direction as the campaign grew. And one of like the most basic things was that I've run companies, and it was always very important to me to know who was at my company. It's like I wanted to interview anyone we hired, like et cetera, et cetera. And then in this candidate mode, I'd be running for office, and then I'd show up at an event, and there'd be like people on my team that I'd never met. And there were a number of reasons for that, because there was just like the practicalities, like, look, like, you're doing all this stuff, and like we had to like hire people, and like I got it. And so then there was like this sense of like it changes like your interactions with people in some respects. Like I don't think I ever really like got the brain damage that power gives. But I can very, very clearly see how it would happen.
I recognize that. I absolutely recognize that. And you just have to notice it happening within yourself. And I think you have to surround yourself with people who are not, too impressed with what you do, and that you just remember that, you're a product of circumstances and of the great work of so many other people, right? So writing a book, for example, I can only do it because there's so many brilliant specialists, anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, economists, etc., doing brilliant work. So now I can make a synthesis of it. But I can't do it without so many of my colleagues and my editors and my correctors, etc., etc. So it's really a group effort. But it's something that you need to remind yourself of. And I think it's also important to have a sort of a culture. There's a little bit of a difference here, I think, between the Netherlands here and the United States, where in the Netherlands, we often see success as a crime, right? Is that there's a bit more of a stronger egalitarian culture. We tend to be distrustful of successful people. And that has its downsides as well. I think it might be one of the reasons why we have fewer like really globally successful companies. I don't know. Someone should do a PhD on that. But it has real benefits as well, because you tend to have politicians who, I don't know, who are maybe a little bit humbler.
In America, it's a problem for sure. And I'm very interested in systemic ways to address this problem, because I think it's really important. There should be policies around it, because having the wrong leader who's sort of losing their humanity, like in positions of power, is terrible. We're seeing that a bit with these protests too, where you can sense that there are some local authority figures who aren't terribly empathetic anymore. Or to the extent they're expressing an emotion, it's like why are you persecuting me and mine? Like, why are you demonizing like my department or whatnot or whatever it is? Like, it's like that they're not seeing the fact that folks are suffering in their community or around them, or that there are legitimate issues and grievances. So there were crimes. So there are, because this to me is a very important issue, Rutger, is like, how the heck do we try and reverse the transformation that power exerts on people?
Have you looked in this whole idea of participatory democracy? Because I think that's very much connected to UBI. I actually, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that, as I said, I started to realize that I needed to dig a little bit deeper and, ask the more fundamental question of what are human beings really like. But a friend and colleague of mine is a Belgian philosopher, David van Rijbroek, and he had just written a book a couple of years ago called Against Elections, where he says we need to move towards a genuine democracy, where you don't just have the right to vote every, 3 or 4 years, but you actually often become a politician yourself, right? You're just randomly elected, for example, just like the Greeks did. I mean, that was the original Greek philosophy of what a real democracy should look like. They sometimes call it deliberative democracy. And so he had written this book with a huge amount of examples and experiments that have been done, again, ever since the 1970s, that actually show that this works, right? So you bring together people around the table, whether they're left-wing or right-wing, rich, poor, young, old. You let them have a discussion about really controversial subjects, whether it's drug policy, taxes, abortion, you name it. And often they come up with sensible compromises. It's pretty amazing if you give them access to experts as well. And it really works. And I think sort of this vision of democracy is also... It also relies on a different view of human nature, right? So it's very much the same as with UBI. I think you can get there once you start looking at other people in a different way. If you see them as these lazy, disengaged people who are not interested in politics and only care about their Netflix and their Amazon Prime account, and then they're just.
I'm a big believer in the wisdom of crowds and the wisdom of people. And to me, we certainly can't do that much worse than the decisions that are being made by like the detached elites who are frankly like running us into the ground, at least, like on many of the biggest issues of our day. So I'm a huge fan of that reimagining of democracy and empowering people to make decisions that would work for them and their communities. I think universal basic income is hand in hand in this. It's like, we're going to make you a genuine stakeholder in our country. We're going to invest in you and your children. And then you should be able to determine where our resources are going in a significant way. Because who's going to make a better decision, you or some asshole like, hundreds or thousands of miles away?
Exactly.
Who's then going to end up like feeding resources into a pipe, and then the pipe's going to be like, I don't trust you. It's like, prove to me that prove to me that you deserve this, or so I'm a big believer in that vision.
That's good to hear. I'm in general, I've become a bit more skeptical of experts, right? Even though sometimes people announce me as, he's an expert on this or an expert on that. But the real experts on people's lives are people themselves. And we now have created this whole, what we call the knowledge economy, where people have a lot of knowledge and they try to make simple things more complex, so that then we need them, right? All these bureaucrats and managers to manage all this complexity. But then maybe you should just go back to school and think about, do we actually need all that complexity, right? Think about healthcare, for example. We've made it so extraordinarily complex, right? The whole insurance system, does it really have to be this way? Or can we just go back to a much more simpler system that, if I look at the Netherlands in the 1980s, it was much simpler, it was just, you just try to help someone who's in a difficult situation. Do we need a huge amount of innovation there? Do we need a huge amount of new apps there and new management philosophies and blah, blah, blah? Or do we actually need to go back to basics and be a little bit more skeptical of all those experts who give TED Talks, right? And say, well, I found the new big thing.
It's like that Dutch entrepreneur that you cite. To make it simple is difficult, and to make it difficult is simple. Or make it. Yeah. I screwed that up. Go ahead, do it right.
The way around. To make it difficult is simple. But to make it simple is difficult.
Yes,
that's it. That's his philosophy. And indeed, he built this quite big healthcare organization with self-directed teams of nurses. Now he has 15,000 employees. It's called buurtzorg, which translates as neighborhood care. And they deliver healthcare at a cheaper cost, higher quality, higher salaries for the employees. It's like win, 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 win. It's like way better than all the competition. And again, it shows you that sort of this whole debate about capitalism versus socialism is a little bit nonsense, because here you have this organization that is obviously funded with taxes, but then is really decentralized, and people just have the freedom to do their job in the best way possible. I think that there's a marriage possible here between two different visions.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the spectrum really needs to be either human or inhuman. And our goal is to humanize our economy and our planet as fast as possible. And you are a massive leader and champion of humanity, Rutger. There are millions of people that look to you for edification and inspiration, and I'm one of them. And I just want to thank you so much for the incredible work you do. It is true. I'm with you. It's like my goal is to try and make some progress and then get the hell out of the way. You know what I mean? Like it's not like, oh, I want to be crouching, like making all the decisions. It's like, I want to help you make your decisions for yourself. And that's a vision that we have to make real as quickly as possible.
I totally agree. You should come over one time here in the Netherlands. We need you here as
well.
I
would love that. And congratulations, Rutger, on his awesome new book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. His last book was a bestseller. I'm sure this one will be too. You should definitely check it out. It will uplift you. It makes you more optimistic about what's possible and about human nature. Thanks
so much, Andrew. I really, really enjoyed this.
Me too. Yeah, I'll come out to the Netherlands. We'll do it again. We'll do this again anytime, man. You can be like a freaking regular. You don't even need to have, written a book that you want to talk about. We can just talk.
Great. Yeah, let's.
Because I know you're always learning. You're always finding out new stuff, and you're one of the world's foremost champions of universal basic income. We have to get this done.